It was the dawn of the Dark Age in Britain, a long stretch of history suspended between light and shadow. When the great Roman roads were already crumbling beneath moss, the towns were hushed, and the old gods had been driven underground, but not entirely forgotten. The island, cold and half-wild, drifted through the centuries, like a candle guttering in the wind. People rose and slept by the sun, prayed for mild winters and full harvests, and measured time not by clocks but by the turning of the seasons. And then, out of the mist, came the north. In the summer of 793 AD, long before the name Viking had settled into legend, a small fleet of ships appeared on the horizon off the coast of Northumbria. They were lean, low, and alive, with movement longboats carved from oak and shaped like dragons, their prows gliding through the fog with uncanny silence. No messenger had warned of their coming, no scouts had seen their sails. The sea, once thought to guard the island, had betrayed it instead, carrying a new kind of terror on its back. At the edge of that sea stood Lindisfarne, a sacred monastery perched on a rocky island, known for its illuminated manuscripts, its bells that sang across the waves, and its peaceful brothers who spent their days in prayer. For decades it had been a haven of calm in a chaotic world, a refuge of light and learning surrounded by the patient sea. Yet to the strangers rowing steadily through the mist, Lindisfarne was not a house of God but a beacon of opportunity, a treasure chest of silver chalices, jeweled crosses, and golden-edged pages left unguarded by men who believed faith was protection enough. The first warning came not from a horn or a shout, but from the sea itself. The soft, rhythmic beating of oars cutting water, the distant creak of timber swollen with salt. At first, the monks mistook it for the wind, or perhaps the call of a distant fishing boat. But as the sound grew louder, a steady, inhuman rhythm, they looked out through the fog and saw them. Narrow ships with painted shields lining their sides, and men standing tall, faces hidden beneath helms of iron and fur. The bells of Lindisfarne began to ring, but their song was swallowed by the clash of steel and the screams of men who had never held a weapon. The Vikings struck with frightening precision, their movements swift, coordinated, and without hesitation. Doors were splintered, torches tossed into thatched roofs, sacred books torn from altars and cast into the fire. To the Vikings, it was business, a raid, a day's work. To the monks, it was the unmaking of the world. When the tide receded hours later, the sea was slick with ash and blood. The monastery that had stood for generations lay blackened, its relics stolen, its brothers dead or taken as slaves. Smoke curled across the horizon like a warning written in the sky, drifting inland toward villages that would soon learn the same fear. This was not merely a robbery, it was a revelation. The attack on Lindisfarne shattered the fragile stillness of early medieval Britain, a land that had survived famine, plague, and war, yet had never imagined death could come so suddenly from the sea. From that day forward, every ripple on the water carried suspicion, and every gust of wind from the north felt like an omen. In time, the scribes would record the event in trembling Latin. The heathens came with terror, and the blood of saints was poured out around the altar. Historians would later call it the moment that truly began the Viking Age, and with it, 2 centuries of fear and fascination that would shape the destiny of the British Isles. So tonight, as we drift together through that distant mist and listen to the slow beat of history's heart, imagine the sound of those oars echoing softly through the fog. Imagine the cold spray of the North Sea, the smell of smoke and salt, the prayers rising into a heaven that suddenly felt very far away. And before we continue this journey through time across raids, kings, and burning shores, take a quiet moment to like this video, share it with a fellow wanderer, and subscribe to the channel, so you won't miss the next story whispered from the edges of history. Now, close your eyes. The tide is coming in again. The longships are already gliding toward shore. And somewhere within the fog of the Dark Age, Britain holds its breath. The fog never lifted that morning. It lay heavy over the Northumbrian coast like a veil between heaven and earth, muting every sound except the slow breathing of the sea. Lindisfarne Holy Island was awake, though barely. The tide whispered against the rocks, and the bells of the monastery tolled softly through the mist, calling a handful of weary monks to prayer. They moved quietly through the cloisters, their sandals brushing over cold stone, voices murmuring Latin hymns that rose faintly into the damp air. To them, this place was the edge of the world, where the divine met the desolate. Isolation, they believed, brought them closer to God. Unfortunately, it also made them easier to find. Lindisfarne was not rich in soldiers or walls. Its wealth was not measured in fortifications or steel, but in faith, art, and devotion. Inside the monastery, illuminated manuscripts gleamed with gold leaf and lapis lazuli pages, of scripture so vivid they seemed to glow even in candlelight. These were works of beauty painstakingly crafted over years, tiny letters painted by steady hands, the labor of minds devoted to prayer and silence. To the monks, these manuscripts were gifts to heaven. But to men who came from across the sea, men who saw gold for what it was and not for what it meant, they were treasure waiting to be claimed. The first signs of danger came not with shouts, but with shadows. Out beyond the mist, something moved long, narrow shapes cutting through the still water. The monks at their morning prayers heard nothing. Perhaps one of them paused mid-verse, sensing something strange in the silence, the way the air seemed to hold its breath. But before fear could find a voice, the longships were already gliding toward the shore. They came with the tide, the sea carrying them as silently as death. The carved dragon heads on their prows sliced through the fog, and behind them, the glint of metal flashed beneath fur-lined cloaks. The men inside Vikings, though the English had no name for them yet, rowed in unison, their oars moving like the beating of a single, terrible heart. They had crossed the cold North Sea in ships that could ride both ocean and river, ships that could appear out of nowhere, strike, and vanish again before the world understood what had happened. On the beach, the first of them leapt into the shallows, water splashing around leather boots and iron blades. They moved quickly, efficiently, their breath misting in the chill air. There were no horns or drums, no warning cries, only the rhythmic crunch of sand beneath their feet as they climbed toward the monastery. Inside, the monks were still at prayer when the door was thrown open. The crash echoed like thunder through the stone hall. At first, the brothers must have thought it was an accident, perhaps fishermen seeking refuge from the storm. But then came the roar of unfamiliar voices, harsh and guttural, like the sea itself speaking in rage. The intruders flooded in, their axes glinting in the dim candlelight. Before the monks could react, before the meaning of this invasion could take shape, the slaughter had begun. Eyewitness accounts, few and fragmented, tell of monks cut down at the altar, their blood spilling across sacred cloth. One chronicler later wrote that the raiders trod the holy places with defiled feet, plundered God's house, and carried off its treasures. The sea outside, it was said, ran dark with ink and blood. Illuminated manuscripts, torn apart and scattered, drifted into the tide, their golden letters dissolving into the salt water like prayers unanswered. The Vikings found little resistance. Lindisfarne was a sanctuary, not a fortress. The monks had no weapons, no soldiers, no walls high enough to keep out what came for them. They had built this place for peace, for solitude, a bridge to heaven. But on that day, heaven was silent. The invaders stripped the altars of silver chalices and gold crucifixes, tore the adornments from the very hands that had blessed them, and left the bodies of the faithful where they fell. To the Vikings, it was not cruelty but necessity. This was how they survived, by taking what they needed from those too weak to defend it. They had been driven here by hunger, by harsh winters and poor harvests that turned men into wolves. To them, this was not sacrilege. It was opportunity. They took the treasures of Lindisfarne as trophies, their laughter echoing through the broken chapel, while the surviving monks fled into the dunes, clutching crucifixes and gasping prayers to a God who seemed not to hear. For the English, the raid was more than tragedy, it was revelation. It marked the end of an illusion, that the sea was a shield, that faith was protection enough. The chroniclers who survived described the attack as though the very heavens had fallen. Alcuin of York, a scholar and clergyman, wrote with horror, "Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race." To those who read his words, the meaning was clear. This was no mere raid. This was punishment, divine or otherwise. In the minds of the faithful, the Vikings were not men but instruments of God's wrath. They came from the north, from the lands beyond maps and mercy, and their violence seemed almost otherworldly. The English had known invaders before: Romans, Saxons, Picts, but this was different. These raiders arrived not to conquer, but to destroy, to plunder, and to vanish. They left behind not new rulers or laws, but ruins and silence. For the monks who survived, Lindisfarne would never again be holy. Its sanctity had been broken, its peace desecrated. The golden manuscripts, the relics, the sacred vessels all gone, melted down or traded for silver across distant seas. The island that had once been a beacon of faith became a symbol of fear. Travelers whispered that God had turned his face away from Britain, that the end of days had begun. And yet, for the Vikings, this day was only a beginning. The raid on Lindisfarne was not an isolated act of violence, but the opening chapter of something far larger. The Northmen had found their gateway into Britain, and through it, a world ripe for conquest and plunder. Word of their success would travel fast across the cold fjords of Scandinavia. Other ships would follow. Other shores would burn. But in that moment, in the stillness after the raid, when smoke drifted over the sea and the tide washed against the stones, it must have felt like the world had shifted. The monks' chants had been silenced, replaced by the crackle of fire and the cawing of seabirds circling above. The fog rolled back in, swallowing the coastline once more, as if trying to hide what had just happened. The sea, indifferent as ever, lapped gently at the shore, erasing footprints and washing away blood. History often remembers great wars and empires, but sometimes it begins with something smaller, the quiet destruction of a single place, a single morning when faith met the blade. Lindisfarne was that morning, the moment when peace itself was cut open, and the world learned to fear the sails that rose out of the northern mist. To the Vikings, it was a successful raid, quick, efficient, and rich in spoils. To the English, it was an apocalypse in miniature, a sign that no sanctuary was safe. The heavens had fallen silent, and the world would never sound the same again. When the fires of Lindisfarne faded into the cold sea mist, the question lingered like smoke over Britain's haunted shores. Why did they come? Why had men from the far north, those pale-skinned strangers with their dragon ships and sharp iron laughter, crossed oceans to slaughter monks and strip gold from altars? The English, steeped in faith and fear, believed it was punishment from God. The truth, however, was far older, far simpler, and far more human. Hunger, hope, and gold. In the harsh lands of Scandinavia, the rugged fjords of Norway, the frozen fields of Sweden, and the pine-dark coasts of Denmark, life was a constant negotiation with the elements. The soil was thin, the winters long, and the sky seemed to withhold its mercy. To live there was to learn endurance. To survive was to make peace with hardship. Yet by the late 8th century, even endurance had begun to fail. The population was growing. The land could no longer feed them all, and the North's fragile balance cracked under the weight of too many mouths and too little earth. Imagine the villages along those northern shores, clusters of timber houses crouched against icy winds, smoke rising from their hearths as families huddled together through the endless dark of winter. The growing season was short, and the harvests, when they came, were meager. A single bad season could doom an entire settlement. Grain rotted in damp stores, and livestock starved when the snows came early. The sea, dark and merciless, swallowed more fishermen than it spared. Hunger wasn't an exception, it was a companion, one that visited each year like an unwelcome guest who refused to leave. And yet, in those same villages, life was not without vitality. Around the hearth fires, stories were told of gods who rewarded bravery and despised weakness. The young men who listened to those sagas grew up believing that fortune favored the bold, that risk was not just necessary, but noble. A man's worth was measured not by comfort, but by his courage. His legacy depended on his ability to carve his name into the world before the cold earth claimed him. For those born into such a creed, the sea did not represent fear. It represented freedom. When the harvests failed and the fields yielded little, the restless turned their eyes to the horizon. The sea was vast, yes, but it was also familiar. It lapped at their doorsteps, whispered through their sleep, and called to them with the promise of something more. The Northmen were not strangers to the waves. They were its children. From their earliest days, they had watched their fathers build ships that danced with the wind, vessels that could slip through narrow rivers and cross open oceans with equal grace. In time, these ships would become their salvation and their sword. The invention of the longship was the turning point. Crafted from oak and bound by iron rivets, sleek and shallow in design, it was a masterpiece of engineering born from necessity. Its hull curved like a serpent's belly, its prow carved into the faces of beasts that could frighten spirits and enemies alike. With it, the Vikings transformed the sea from an obstacle into a highway. They could travel where others could not, skimming across the fjords, threading through rivers, appearing without warning on coasts that had never before known danger. At first, their journeys were small, trading, exploring, probing the edges of the known world. But trade can easily become temptation. Across the gray waters to the west, rumors drifted home with the winds. There was a land, they said, where the soil was rich and the people soft, a land of green pastures, gold crosses, and silver chalices, a land where monks sat in stone houses, writing holy words in books adorned with jewels and gold leaf books so precious they were said to shine like treasure in the candlelight. To men who knew hunger, who had lived their lives carving existence from rock and frost, such stories sounded like promises from the gods themselves. And so, the restless sons of the north began to dream. They dreamed of fertile land and easy plunder, of wealth that did not demand years of toil. They dreamed of freedom from hunger, from servitude, from the endless winter of their homeland. When spring returned and the ice broke on the fjords, they built new ships more, faster, stronger. Each hammer strike echoed with hunger and ambition. Every plank of oak they laid was another step toward a new life. To the old men who stayed behind, these expeditions were risky, perhaps even reckless. But to the young, the sea was the only path left. They were raised in a world that admired daring, that worshipped the gods of thunder and war, that believed dying with a sword in hand was better than dying with a shovel in the field. When the ships launched from the harbors, the entire village would gather to watch. The mothers wept quietly, the fathers stood in grim silence, and the young warriors laughed and sang, their oars dipping into the water like clockwork. They set their sails toward the unknown, guided by stars and instinct, driven by desperation and greed in equal measure. The horizon was not a boundary, it was an invitation. Beyond it lay England, Ireland, and the Frankish kingdoms, lands richer, warmer, and more vulnerable than their own. The Vikings did not come with kings or armies. They came with hunger. And hunger is a force far more dangerous than politics. When they first reached the British shores, what they found must have astonished them. Green hills rolled endlessly toward the sea, rivers glittered with salmon, and monasteries stood fat with treasure, not guarded fortresses, but sanctuaries built for peace. To men who had spent their lives surviving by the axe and the net, these places were almost absurdly defenseless. No walls, no weapons, no watchmen, only bells, prayers, and gold. The first raid at Lindisfarne proved what the rumors had promised: the western lands were ripe for taking. Word of the success spread back across the sea with the same speed that the ships had traveled. Stories of easy gold, of terrified monks, of ships heavy with plunder reached the northern villages before the snow fell again. Each tale grew in the telling, feeding the fire of ambition. Soon, entire communities turned to the sea, some for glory, others simply to survive. But it would be wrong to see them only as villains. The Vikings did not come from malice alone. They came from necessity. Their raids were not acts of cruelty for cruelty's sake, but the natural extension of a people pushed to the brink. Hunger had forged their courage, hardship had sharpened their instincts, and desperation had taught them to take whatever the world denied them. Gold was the means, but survival was the motive. And yet, it would also be wrong to romanticize them. They did not hesitate to burn, to kill, to enslave. Their ambition, once unleashed, became an inferno. The same hunger that had driven them from their icy homeland now consumed everything it touched. The sea became their accomplice, and the coasts of Europe their table. The Viking Age had begun not with a declaration of war, but with the growl of empty stomachs and the gleam of gold in the mist. To the Northmen, the world was opening. To the monks of Lindisfarne, it was ending. In truth, both were right. The sea that connected them would carry not just ships and silver, but the first great cultural collision of the medieval world. Somewhere, in a smoky longhouse deep in the fjords, a skald would later sing of these first voyages of the brave men who dared to cross the whale road, who faced storms and enemies, and came home with their ships heavy with silver. But behind the song's proud verses, Behind the clang of cups and laughter lingered the quiet truth. They had gone not for glory, but because their homeland could no longer feed them. Hunger had driven them to the sea, hope had steered their course, and gold, glinting, sacred, irresistible, had shown them where to land. Thus the world turned, as it always does, on the simplest of needs: hunger, hope, and gold, the oldest engines of human ambition. And across the dark water, the English prayed for mercy, unaware that the storm had only just begun. The hunger that drove the Northmen to the sea would have led nowhere without the vessel that made it possible, the longship. In every saga, every chronicle, every whispered legend that followed the first Viking raids, the same image endures: a shadow gliding across the dawn, sleek as a serpent, silent as smoke. It was not simply a ship, it was the sharp edge of an entire civilization. To the terrified monks of Lindisfarne and the trembling coastal villages that followed, the longship was more than wood and iron, it was the embodiment of the storm itself. Born of necessity and refined by centuries of observation, the longship was an invention so perfect in form and function that it would define the entire Viking age. It was built like a living creature, long, narrow, and shallow-keeled, designed to skim over the sea as easily as it could slide through a river's current or scrape across muddy banks. While the ships of the south lumbered through deep waters like beasts burdened by armor, the longship moved with the grace of a predator. It was a serpent, not a whale patient, swift and deadly. The keel was its spine, strong but supple, carved from oak that had grown in the cold northern soil. Each plank was shaped and overlapped with precision, fastened by hand-forged rivets that gleamed faintly in the lamplight of the shipyard. Its hull curved inward and upward, giving it both strength and speed. When the wind caught its square sail, dyed red or striped like flame, the longship could cut through waves faster than anything else afloat in the medieval world. And when the wind failed, the oars took over 40 to 80 men rowing in perfect rhythm, the slap of blades on water blending with the low growl of voices chanting to keep time. But the true genius of the longship lay not in its speed, but in its versatility. Its shallow draft, barely 3 feet deep, allowed it to travel where no other vessel could follow. It could ride the open ocean one day and glide silently up a river the next, bringing the sea itself into the heart of a kingdom. For the people of England and Francia, this was a horror they could never have imagined. Their towns, even those far inland, were no longer safe. The Vikings could appear without warning out of the mist, out of the tide, out of the very rivers that had once protected them. Picture the scene: dawn breaking over a quiet English village, the water glinting gold in the first light of morning. Fishermen at the riverbank hauling their nets, children chasing each other through fields still damp with dew. And then, from the bend of the river, a shadow lengthens. A carved dragon's head rises from the mist, its wooden eyes gleaming. Another follows, and another. The fishermen stop, their hands frozen mid-motion, as oars dip into the water with unnatural precision. 1, 2, 1, 2, the sound measured and inhuman. Before the church bell can toll, the longships have arrived. By the time the villagers understand what they're seeing, it's already too late. To the Vikings, this was not magic, but mastery. The longship gave them control of 2 worlds, land and sea. It allowed them to raid with precision, to strike where their enemies were weakest, and to vanish before resistance could gather. When a monastery burned on the coast, no one knew from where the raiders had come or where they had gone. Their speed made them myths. Their silence made them nightmares. Each longship was both a weapon and a home. On it, the crew ate, slept, and lived as brothers in arms. The deck was narrow and low, but it belonged entirely to them. They slept beneath their shields, ate from wooden bowls, and told stories of their gods: Odin, who demanded courage, and Thor, who blessed the strong. They carved runes into the timbers for luck, charms to protect against storms and spirits. And when the ship was ready to sail, they believed it carried not just their bodies, but their fate. The carved figurehead at the prow, often a dragon, serpent, or wolf, was more than decoration. It was a guardian and a symbol. To their enemies, it was a terror rising from the sea. To the crew, it was the spirit of the ship itself. Before landing, some captains would remove or cover the dragon head, fearing it might offend the spirits of the land they approached. Even in their brutality, the Northmen were deeply superstitious, their lives woven between belief and blood. The coordination required to move a longship was remarkable. Every man on board knew his place. The steersman at the stern controlled the great oar that guided direction. The helmsman called the rhythm for the rowers, who obeyed without question. When wind and tide favored them, they could cover 100 miles in a day. Their shallow hulls allowed them to beach the ship directly on the shore, no need for docks or harbors. They could strike, loot, and be gone in the time it took a messenger to ride for help. The longship's power was psychological as much as physical. To those who had never seen such vessels before, they seemed to emerge from nowhere sleek, silent, unstoppable. Chroniclers described them as demons on the water, and in truth, the image fit. The dragon's heads, the fluttering sails, the symmetry of the oars moving like wings, it was as if the sea itself had come alive and learned to kill. In a time when communication was slow and kingdoms were fragmented, this mobility was revolutionary. The longship erased distance, erased warning, erased the idea of safety. Monasteries, villages, even royal estates, none could sleep easily once the Vikings mastered the art of turning rivers into roads. From the Seine to the Thames, from the Rhine to the Shannon, their ships carved through Europe like veins of fire. It is easy, centuries later, to romanticize the longship, to see it as a marvel of design, a testament to northern ingenuity. And it was. But for those who lived in its shadow, it was the stuff of nightmares. Its arrival at dawn meant death before noon. Its departure meant a silence more terrible than its presence. For in its wake lay only ruin. The longship was both creation and destruction, a masterpiece built to end peace. Even its construction spoke of the paradox that defined the Viking Age. The same hands that shaped fine carvings and built churches in later years had once crafted these perfect engines of war. Each ship was the result of extraordinary craftsmanship, every plank shaped with care, every nail driven by hand. It took months of labor and skill to create what might, in a single raid, undo years of another man's life. The beauty of the longship was inseparable from its purpose: to move swiftly, to strike hard, to disappear. And yet there was poetry in it too. When not drenched in blood or smoke, a longship at sea was a sight of terrible beauty, its sail catching the wind, its hull slicing through waves that glittered in the northern light. To those who sailed aboard her, she was freedom incarnate, the embodiment of everything that made their world bearable. In a land of hunger and cold, she was motion, life, and possibility. She could carry a man to fortune, or to his death, often both. The longship's legacy would outlive the men who built it. Centuries later, archaeologists would unearth their remains. The Oseberg ship, the Gokstad ship, resting in the earth like sleeping beasts, their wood still whispering of salt and storm. Even buried, they seemed poised to move, as if waiting for the wind's command once more. In the end, the longship was the perfect reflection of the people who made it: elegant, ruthless, and unstoppable. It turned hunger into conquest, isolation into expansion, survival into legend. It was both their weapon and their salvation, their home and their curse. And when one appeared at dawn, its sail rising like a blood-red sun over the horizon, those who saw it knew that no prayer could save them. A longship at dawn was both a miracle of engineering and a nightmare in motion, the sea's own instrument of war, and the heartbeat of an age that would change the world forever. The longships had done their work and vanished like a bad dream, leaving behind the first thin tongues of smoke curling from thatched roofs. Now, with the tide and the oars gone, it fell to the raiders to finish what the ships had begun. What followed was less improvisation than a cold, practiced choreography, a method so exacting that, to the men who practiced it, it must have felt like common sense. Where others saw chaos and rage, the Norse saw a formula: choose the softest target, strike before the world wakes, gather everything that glinted, and melt away into the mist before help could arrive. The perfect raid was not merely violence, it was logistics, timing, and a ruthless economy of motion, a recipe refined over decades of summers spent watching coasts and rivers, testing wind and tide, and learning how to make fear itself into an instrument. Isolated wealth presented itself like an invitation. Monasteries perched on islands or promontories glittered from a distance, not because they were ostentatious in an ignoble sense, but because centers of devotion had become centers of accumulation. Gilded chalices, embroidered textiles, jars of incense, and books bound in leather and gold. Monks traded with merchants, accepted gifts from lords grateful for prayers, and carefully preserved relics that drew pilgrims and donations. Coastal villages, too, were larders of small treasure: salted fish, cloaks, a few coins hidden in wooden boxes, perhaps a merchant's chest left unattended. Trade posts hummed with goods from afar, bundles of cloth and metal tools, exotic beads and spices. For a people whose homeland could be stern and thin, such concentrations of wealth were magnets, and the longship made approaching them effortlessly possible. The selection of a target was not random but practical. Scouts, sometimes traders with friendly faces, sometimes drunken wanderers, had long informed captains about the mornings when fewer lookouts were posted, about hamlets whose watchmen had been bribed with mead, about monasteries with weak defenses or infirm monks. The ideal target sat alone, its back to the sea and its awareness elsewhere. Or else it was a bustling way station with goods left to rot in the sun between shipments. The contrast between a monastery's peace and its riches created the most profitable calculus. Inside a chapel, the altar held not only piety but silver and small treasures, and the cloister's solitude meant no militia would be at hand. To sack a monastery was to take a treasure trove with minimal resistance. To torch a village was to ensure there would be no future warning for neighbors of the same fate. Timing mattered as much as choice. Dawn, before the roosters, and before the bell that called men to prayer, was the optimal hour. In the earliest light, sleep would still cling to eyes. Oaths were still warm from lips already half awake. No one expected the shore itself to become an assailant. Moving at that hour meant exploiting the human patterns of vulnerability, the predictable lull between night's end and the day's activity, and the raiders were meticulous in their exploitation. They landed quietly, slipping sand and pebbles off their boots lest any crunch give them away. They moved in small groups, each with a specific task: one to secure the boats, one to gather plunder, one to watch the approach of smoke or riders. They did not need to shout to be effective. Methodical, low commands and practiced gestures sufficed. The world woke to its own destruction. Once inside, the raiders acted like efficient thieves rather than purely berserk warriors, though the two states could coexist in a brutality that shocked the defenders. The most valuable things were often small and easily carried. Reliquaries studded with gems, chalices heavy with silver, altar cloths embroidered with gold thread. Books, especially illuminated manuscripts, were prized because their bindings often incorporated costly materials. To a Viking who understood trade, such items could be exchanged for broad strips of coin in a foreign harbor. For this reason, monks, whose lives measured in hours of prayer and study, seemed to defy the raiders' logic, nevertheless became targets not only of violence but of profit. Ransoms could be demanded for prominent captives, and in some instances monks were seized and sold into slavery rather than slaughtered, their piety a commodity that could be bartered. The practicalities of plunder were precise. Raiders swept through rooms in ordered fashion. One man pulled open chests while another pried loose fittings. A third kept watch at the doorway to ensure no unexpected militia returned. Items of liturgical importance were not merely material to them. Reliquaries and icons could be paraded back in their homelands as trophies, displayed in halls and described in sagas, proof of a raid's success which, in that culture, translated directly to honor. The spoils also served the immediate needs of the crew: cloth for warmth, salt for preservation, silver for trade. Nothing was too trivial to be left behind. Even a finely carved wooden comb could become a token of status in a new life ashore. Yet raids were not purely transactional. They were also performative acts meant to terrify. After the valuables were seized, fires were set not out of wanton destruction alone, but to ensure the signal could not be ignored, to announce the raid's success, and to burn the possibility of immediate pursuit. Smoke rising from the thatch meant that even distant villages could see the result of a raid and weigh their defenses accordingly. It was misinformation and intimidation in one. Sometimes the raiders left a messenger of horror. A single house burned while the rest remained intact. a body displayed where the town might see it. These gestures transformed isolated acts of theft into psychological warfare. The goal was not always to leave a town dead. Occasionally, the intention was to hollow it out, to make it unreliable as a refuge and thereby redistribute the population into spaces more favorable to later raids or settlement. Speed ensured survival. The longer a party lingered, the higher the chances of a counterattack. Thus, a raid's rhythm was compact. Land at first light, take what can be carried, decide quickly whether to take prisoners for ransom, burn what must be burned, and withdraw before the horizon filled with riders or the distant sound of a militia drum. The longship's design enabled rapid extraction. Beached and pulled up on the sand, it waited like a patient animal with mouths of oarlocks wide open to swallow the returning crew. When the raiders pushed off, their departure was as brisk as their arrival, leaving behind silence, smoke, and the echoing questions that would trouble survivors for years. There was also a professional culture to raiding. Captains learned from one another, tactics evolved, and successes or failures were shared in mead halls and around communal fires. A raid that went smoothly would be recounted and refined. One that turned into slaughter or entrapment would be analyzed and used as a cautionary tale. Over time, this created a surprising degree of innovation. Better scouting methods, improved coordination with maritime timing, and even rudimentary diplomacy, where paying off a coastal lord became more economical than burning his town. The Norse were not mindless brutes, but pragmatic opportunists who adapted their strategies to changing circumstances, willing to convert conquest into commerce when it suited them. To contemporaries on the receiving end, the efficiency was unbearable. Chroniclers of the time could not help but describe raids as apocalyptic, as if the world itself had been rearranged overnight. For monks, the theft of a reliquary was not mere robbery, it was sacrilege, a symbolic assault on the spiritual order. For villagers, the loss of a single barn or a herd of sheep could mean winter without food, and the slow death of children come spring. In every instance, the raids were disproportionate in their consequences. A handful of men could decide whether a family ate that year or starved. This economy of violence: choose the isolated target, move at dawn, strip the shiny things, vanish into fog, and tide was efficient in the clinical sense, but brutal in human terms. It was a model of asymmetrical warfare, centuries before the phrase would exist. It turned the sea into both weapon and ally, used speed as a weapon, and leveraged surprise to convert minimal force into maximal result. Efficiency, when weaponized, becomes terror, and the Viking raid perfected that conversion. In the months and years that followed Lindisfarne and other early attacks, this formula would be copied, adapted, and institutionalized across a wide geography. Towns learned to band together, to raise walls, and to establish beacons. Kings and earls hired guards and levied taxes to pay for defense. But even as defenses tightened, the method endured because it relied on human patterns as much as on metal. The reliance on isolation, the trust in the dawn, the temptation of surface shine. For every wall built, there were untold stretches of coast and inland river where the formula still found purchase. The longship returned again and again, and with each appearance the formula proved its grim utility. Pick your prey, strike before they wake, take what gleams, and leave no trace but smoke and silence. The raids were swift, the strategy ruthless, but without the tools that turned hunger and courage into conquest, the Viking expansion would have been little more than noise on the wind. Steel, not just salt or sweat, forged the North's legend. To the Vikings, weapons were not mere instruments of war, they were extensions of the soul, heirlooms of blood and belief, and companions on every raid, duel, and death. The same cold iron that bit through bone and shield also bore the weight of a man's honor, his lineage, and his name. When a Viking warrior gripped his weapon, he was not simply arming himself, he was awakening something sacred. The North did not produce swords and spears in abundance, but what it did craft was made to endure. The weapons of the Viking Age reflected the very character of the people who wielded them: practical, lethal, and beautifully simple. Spears, axes, sea axes, and swords, these were not only tools of war, but symbols of identity, and through them, the sea-roving raiders of Scandinavia reshaped the medieval world. The spear came first, the oldest and most common of all weapons. It was the weapon of farmers, hunters, and warriors alike, born from necessity and refined by experience. A Viking spear was not a crude stick tipped with metal but a carefully balanced instrument, its iron head designed for both thrusting and throwing. Its reach kept enemies at bay. Its versatility made it indispensable, and its symbolism tied it directly to Odin, the Allfather, who was said to have hurled his own spear, Gungnir, across the heavens to begin battle. To carry a spear was to invoke divine lineage. To throw it before a fight began was to dedicate the combat to the gods. But if the spear was sacred, the axe was personal. Every Viking carried one, not out of choice, but out of survival. The axe was a tool before it was a weapon used to chop wood, build homes, carve boats, and butcher meat. Yet, when the time came, the same tool that felled trees could fell men. Viking axes were built for function, not display. Single-bladed, with crescent-shaped heads designed to hook shields or limbs, and short enough to swing in the tight press of combat. They were often homemade, forged from whatever metal could be found or traded, and thus carried the marks of the individual who owned them: a notch, a carving, a binding of leather around the grip. There was no shame in carrying an axe. In fact, among common warriors, it was the mark of honest strength. A good axe could split more than wood. It could split kingdoms. Some of the most feared warriors in Norse history, the Huskarls and Berserkers, fought with axes that could shear through helmets and bone alike. To face one in battle was to face the embodiment of northern ferocity. A man whose every swing could end a life, whose every breath carried the rhythm of a people who had learned long ago that nothing in this world was given freely, everything had to be taken. Then came the sea axe, the great knife of the north. Somewhere between tool and weapon, the sea axe was a blade every man owned, no matter his rank. It was used to skin animals, cut rope, prepare food, or, when necessary, finish a fight. Unlike the spear or the sword, it was intimate, its edge close to the body, its purpose direct. The sea axe's name would later give rise to Saxon, the tribe whose identity was defined by it, but the blade's reach spread far beyond a single culture. Vikings carried them at all times, sheathed at the hip, the constant reminder that survival was as much about readiness as it was about strength. In a world where death could come at any turn of the road, the sea axe was a silent promise that no man would die unarmed. But above all, above spear and axe and sea axe, stood the sword. Rare, expensive, and revered, the sword was the Viking's crown jewel. To possess one was not simply to be armed, it was to be marked as someone of worth, a man whose deeds or inheritance justified such beauty. Forged by master smiths from pattern-welded iron, each blade shimmered with veins of silver and shadow, a kind of rippling texture that seemed alive in the light. The hilt was bound in leather or silver wire, the guard often engraved with runes or intricate knotwork. It was said that a sword's soul came from the fire, its heart from the man who wielded it. Swords were named, for they were not treated as objects but as companions. Some bore names whispered with reverence: Gram, the blade that slew Fafnir the dragon; Skofnung, said to hum when drawn in vengeance; Hildebrand, passed from father to son until both name and blade were legend. To lose such a sword was to lose more than a weapon. It was to lose honor, heritage, and perhaps even divine favor. When a warrior fell, his sword was buried beside him or broken and cast into the sea, a ritual to return its spirit to the elements. A Viking's weapon defined his place in the world. The humble carried axes, the skilled bore spears, and the noble brandished swords, yet all were bound by the same creed: that iron was truer than words, and courage brighter than gold. The glint of a polished blade was a reflection of the man himself, not merely his strength, but his discipline. Warriors cleaned and oiled their weapons with the same care monks gave to their manuscripts. A dull sword was an insult, a neglected axe a sign of weakness. In a culture where reputation was everything, even the weapon had to gleam with pride. But the arsenal of the North was not limited to hand-to-hand arms. The Vikings also mastered ranged weapons, the bow and arrow. Though not as romanticized as their melee counterparts, they were essential tools of hunting and warfare alike. A Viking bow could bring down both deer and man with equal ease. Made of yew or ash, reinforced with sinew, it required enormous strength to draw. In ambushes or from ships approaching a coast, volleys of arrows would precede the charge, turning confusion into panic before the first axe fell. Every weapon in the Viking arsenal served more than one purpose: to hunt, to build, to kill, to earn glory. This practicality came from necessity, but it also revealed something profound about their worldview. The Vikings did not separate life from war, or peace from violence. The same hands that shaped timber into ships, plowed fields, and carved runes were equally adept at drawing blood. Their weapons were not symbols of destruction alone, they were tools of creation, for through conquest they built their world, expanded their trade, and secured their families' futures. Yet for all their power, the weapons of the North carried with them a kind of melancholy. Iron was precious, and forging a blade was a sacred act. Every strike of the hammer over the anvil was accompanied by belief in craftsmanship, in courage, in fate. The runes carved into hilts were prayers as much as marks of ownership. Some bore invocations to Thor or Tyr, others to nameless ancestors. Each blade, in its own way, was a story of its maker, its wielder, its victims. On the battlefield, this arsenal came alive in a brutal harmony. The front lines bristled with spears, shields locked together into a wall of wood and iron. Behind them, axes rose and fell with terrible rhythm, cleaving through defenses. Arrows darkened the sky, and swords flashed in the chaos like streaks of sunlight on the sea. It was not elegant warfare, but it was effective, a storm given human shape. To their enemies, the Vikings seemed invincible. To themselves, they were merely prepared. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, that war was not about size or numbers, but readiness and will. A dull blade could mean death. A cracked shield could cost victory. And so, in every hall across the North, warriors tended their weapons as if tending their own souls. Even the humblest axe, resting against the hearth, carried the memory of empire. It could build a home or break one. It could shape a beam or a dynasty. In the right hands, it could split not only wood but kingdoms. And when the longships once again cut through the mist toward foreign shores, their crews carried with them not just hunger and ambition, but the arsenal of the North, the iron heartbeat of an age that would be remembered in both terror and awe. Each gleaming edge was a fragment of northern fire, a reminder that civilization itself can be carved from the raw iron of survival. If the sword was the pride of the North, the shield was its conscience. Where one symbolized honor, the other embodied survival. In the frozen fjords and smoky longhouses of Scandinavia, every man knew that courage meant little if it did not come with the sense to stay alive. Battles were not won by those who charged first or shouted loudest, but by those who endured, who understood how to stand, how to guard, and how to outlast. And nothing captured that art of endurance better than the Viking shield. Armor, though admired, was a luxury. Iron was scarce in the North, and forging a coat of mail or a full helmet required wealth beyond most men's means. The chieftains, nobles, and a few seasoned warriors might wear chainmail, each tiny ring hammered and linked by hand, but the majority fought with nothing but courage, leather, and luck. Steel was heavy, expensive, and rare. A single shirt of mail could cost more than a small farm, and while it offered fine protection, it also slowed the wearer, weighed him down in the mud and blood of battle. For the average raider, mobility was a better defense than metal. Speed was survival. So they turned instead to the one piece of equipment that almost every warrior, rich or poor, could afford: the shield. A Viking shield was more than protection. It was an identity, a companion, a portable wall against death itself. Round, broad, and deceptively simple, it was usually made of sturdy planks of fir or pine, bound together with rawhide or iron rim. The diameter could stretch to nearly a meter, large enough to cover the body from shoulder to knee. At its heart sat an iron boss, a domed piece of metal that covered the hand grip, deflecting blows and turning aside sword strikes that might otherwise cleave bone. Yet, for all its practicality, the shield was also a work of art. Vikings painted their shields in bold colors: reds, blacks, yellows, blues, often divided into geometric patterns or adorned with symbols meant to invoke luck or frighten the enemy. Some bore knotwork designs that mimicked serpents or waves, a nod to the gods of the sea and sky. Others carried personal marks, the sign of a clan, a rune of protection, or even a boast painted in rough strokes. When the light of dawn fell upon a Viking line, the sight of 100 colored shields advancing together was like a moving tapestry of war, a wall of art and death. But the shield was more than decoration. It was the difference between life and oblivion. To a Viking, it was not just for blocking, it was a tool for bashing, for pushing, for shaping the flow of battle. In the crush of combat, where men stood shoulder to shoulder, shields were used like rams, slamming into enemies with the force of a wave. A well-timed shield bash could stagger a foe, open a guard, and create the single heartbeat of opportunity a man needed to strike. In their shield walls, the Vikings wielded these discs of wood not as passive defenses but as living extensions of their will. And when the battle ended, the shield remained loyal. It could carry the wounded, serve as a makeshift stretcher, or even a sled over snow. In camps, it might be laid down as a table, a pillow, or a cradle for sleeping children. A dead warrior might be laid upon his shield before burial, the wood serving as both bed and coffin, a final act of protection, even in death. In some sagas, it was said that a true warrior never left his shield behind, not because of cowardice, but because to abandon it was to abandon one's place among the living. The Vikings' mastery of defense went hand in hand with their understanding of formation. The famous Skjaldborg, the shield wall, was a cornerstone of their tactics, a mobile fortress made not of stone or timber, but of men and trust. Warriors stood in tight ranks, shields overlapping like scales, forming a single surface against which arrows and spears shattered harmlessly. Behind this wall, the Northmen advanced, step by measured step, the thump of their boots and the rhythmic clang of their shields merging into a single, ominous heartbeat. The shield wall was not elegant. It was claustrophobic, heavy, and brutal. Each man felt the weight of his brother's shield against his arm, the vibration of each strike echoing through wood and flesh alike. The first row bore the brunt of the assault, their shields splintering under the relentless pounding of arrows and axes. When one man fell, another stepped forward without hesitation. Discipline and instinct held the wall together. If even one faltered, the formation could crumble, and the chaos that followed was often fatal. What kept them steady was more than training. It was belief not only in themselves, but in one another. To stand in a Viking shield wall was to surrender the illusion of individuality and become part of something larger, something living. Each shield was a rib. Together, they formed the rib cage that guarded the heart of the North. And then there was the helmet, that most misunderstood of artifacts. Modern imagination has burdened the Viking with horns, a creation not of history but of opera. In truth, the Norse warrior would have laughed or cursed at such a foolish adornment. Horns on a helmet were suicide in battle, little more than handles for an enemy to grab, a way to unbalance and expose the wearer. No, the real helmets of the North were practical, simple iron or bronze caps with a nasal guard to protect the face, sometimes padded with leather beneath. They were plain, functional, and heavy enough to deflect a glancing sword or arrow, but not so heavy as to hinder the swing of a weapon. Few could afford such luxury. Most fought bareheaded or with leather cowls, relying on speed and skill rather than armor to keep them alive. Those who wore helmets were marked not as decorated warriors, but as men who had either survived enough battles to earn them or inherited them from the dead. In the sagas, helmets are mentioned sparingly, and always with respect. They were not fashion, they were inheritance. It is easy, centuries later, to imagine Vikings as reckless berserkers, charging blindly into the fray with nothing but madness in their eyes. But the truth is subtler and far more impressive. Their survival depended not on frenzy, but on method. Every piece of their equipment, from the curve of a shield to the weight of a helmet, spoke to an understanding of war that balanced aggression with caution. They were not simply destroyers. They were craftsmen of conflict, building order out of chaos. A shield could tell a story. You could trace the history of a warrior in its scars, the deep gouge where an axe had been turned aside, the blackened edge burned by fire, the faded paint rubbed away by years of battle. Some shields bore symbols carved for each victory. Others were kept plain, as if modesty itself were armor. When one finally broke, shattered by a blow too strong to withstand it, was often burned in ceremony, its ashes scattered to the wind or sea. To lose a shield was not shameful. To fail to use it well was. So much of Viking life revolved around endurance, and in their weapons and defenses, that endurance found its truest expression. A man could live without mail, without a sword, even without boots. But without a shield, he was nothing. It was both protection and promise, the thing that stood between him and death, between his brothers and oblivion. The Vikings may have been famed for their axes and swords, but it was their shields, those round, painted circles of defiance, that allowed them to survive long enough to earn their legends. In the end, the arsenal of the North was not only about what could kill, but what could keep a man breathing. The shield, the helmet, the leather strap binding it all together, these were the unsung heroes of Viking warcraft. And though centuries of myth have dressed them in horns and fantasy, the truth is more powerful. Real warriors carried no ornament. Their beauty was in their resilience, their art in the simple, stubborn act of staying alive, because in a world where death could come from any direction, from blade, from sea, from winter, survival itself was an act of glory. And no one knew that better than the men who stood behind round shields, their faces half hidden beneath iron, staring into the dawn, waiting once again for the oars to bring the storm. The shield was never meant to stand alone. One man with one shield could block a blow, perhaps even survive a single duel, but war was never so simple. On the fields where kingdoms were decided and villages burned, survival depended on unity, on the ability to turn 100 men into one unyielding being. Thus was born the shield wall, the Skjaldborg, the living fortress of the North. It was not a formation in the modern sense, not the product of written orders or military schools. It was instinct, ritual, and inheritance, a way of standing together that turned chaos into order, fear into defiance. When the Northmen formed the shield wall, they became something more than soldiers. Shoulder to shoulder, shield overlapping shield, they moved as one, a single creature of wood, iron, and will. Each man's round shield locked against his neighbor's, forming an unbroken barrier that stretched across the field like the hull of a ship turned upright. From a distance, it looked almost alive, undulating as the men beneath it adjusted their stances and braced against the weight of the world pressing toward them. The left arm carried faith, the right arm carried steel. Together, they were both wall and weapon, immovable and unrelenting. The air before battle was thick with waiting. The ground trembled beneath marching feet, and somewhere beyond the fog or the tree line came the shouts of an approaching enemy. In that tense moment, the wall was both protection and prison. Inside, it was hot, suffocating, and close. There was no space to breathe freely, no room to flinch. The man to your right depended on your strength as much as you depended on his. The wood of your shield dug into your forearm, the rim pressing into your ribs, the iron boss rattling each time a spear tip struck. The world narrowed to sound the crack of wood, the grunt of effort, the hiss of arrows breaking against your line. There was nothing romantic about the shield wall. It was claustrophobic, heavy, and brutal. It was the grinding of bodies, the stink of sweat and fear, the strange rhythm of survival that came from holding fast when every instinct screamed to run. When two shield walls met, the impact was like thunderwood slamming against wood, the shudder running through every man down the line. Shields splintered, spears snapped, and men stumbled into the narrow gaps where death came quick and messy. In those moments, the wall became less a tactic and more a test of faith, not in gods or kings, but in endurance itself. The shield wall demanded trust beyond blood. Brothers stood beside strangers, farmers beside seasoned warriors, their only connection the shared belief that together they could become something indestructible. The weakest link decided the fate of all. If one man's courage faltered, if one shield dropped, the formation fractured, and once a wall broke, it was almost impossible to rebuild. The first crack was always the loudest sound on the battlefield, the signal that panic might seep through like water through a breach in a dam. The discipline required to hold was immense. No shouting charges, no glorious single combats. The wall was patient. It advanced in slow, heavy steps, like an ancient beast dragging itself across the earth. Every pace was calculated, Every strike was measured. The front line bore the brunt of the fight, their shields hammered by spears and axes, their legs slick with mud and blood. Behind them, the second and third ranks pressed forward, pushing the line, reinforcing it with weight and presence. The wall was both offensive and defensive at once. It advanced like a tide, absorbing blows, deflecting arrows, crushing opposition beneath its steady rhythm. Sometimes, when the enemy faltered, the front rank would surge forward, breaking formation just enough to stab with short swords or thrust with spears between the cracks. Then, just as quickly, they would retreat back into the safety of the line, as if the wall itself had lashed out and then withdrawn. This was not chaos, it was choreography, perfected through repetition, through years of practice in raids and skirmishes across coasts and rivers. The sound of a shield wall in motion was unforgettable. It began with the soft shuffle of boots on dirt, the creak of wood and leather, the low hum of men muttering prayers or curses under their breath. Then came the impact, the metallic percussion of weapons meeting defense, the collective roar that followed as both sides strained against each other. The Vikings often used rhythm to keep formation, beating their shields with sword hilts or chanting in unison, the noise rising into a kind of war song that carried across the field. The sound alone could unnerve their enemies, a heartbeat of wood and fury, promising that the North did not break easily. But if the shield wall was the Vikings' greatest strength, it was also their greatest vulnerability. Once broken, it became a slaughterhouse. The same closeness that made it strong made it deadly when it failed. There was no room to retreat, no way to turn. If a man fell, he dragged his neighbor with him. If a shield shattered, it left a hole that widened with every heartbeat. The wall's power lay in unity, its doom in fracture. And yet, time after time, the Vikings trusted it not because they thought it invincible, but because they believed themselves to be. To the men who stood behind those shields, there was no greater statement than to hold when others fled. The wall was not just a formation, it was a declaration. We will not yield before you do. It was the embodiment of northern stubbornness, that grim, cold refusal to bend even when logic demanded surrender. It was courage, not as a momentary spark, but as a sustained act of will. In the sagas, heroes were often remembered for breaking through enemy lines. But equally honored were those who held the line, whose shields did not waver even when the tide turned against them. The poet who sang of battle might name kings and jarls, but he always remembered the nameless warriors who stood their ground in the wall, those whose only monument was the wood that broke in their hands. The shield wall was also an equalizer. Inside it, nobility meant nothing. The richest lord stood shoulder to shoulder with the poorest farmer, their differences erased by the mud beneath their feet and the terror in their lungs. A king's armor could not save him if the man beside him faltered. A peasant's courage could save them both. In that narrow space between life and death, hierarchy dissolved. What mattered was not birth, but endurance. Perhaps that was why the shield wall endured for so long, not only among Vikings, but across all of medieval Europe. It was more than strategy. It was a philosophy. In a world where life was short and violent, unity was the closest thing to immortality. A single warrior could be forgotten, his name swallowed by time. But a wall of men standing together, refusing to fall, could become legend. And so they stood. In Northumbria, on the Irish coasts, in the fields of Francia, and even on the banks of the Seine, the wooden fortress of the north advanced again and again. The enemy might mock their lack of heavy armor or cavalry, but when the wall began to move, when the sea of shields rippled forward with the precision of a living machine, fear crept into every heart, for beneath the noise and the blood, there was something almost sacred in that act of defiance. It was not about conquest, not entirely. It was about identity, about what it meant to be from the north, to face the impossible and hold anyway. The shield wall was not invincible, but it was eternal in spirit. It was the embodiment of a creed older than kingdoms and written in no law but survival. Stand together or die alone. And when it broke, when shields splintered, and men fell, and the roar turned to silence, the survivors would gather the fragments, repair them, and build it again. Because the wall was never just wood and iron, it was memory, blood, and faith, the living heartbeat of a people who refused to bow. A shield could save a man, but a wall of shields could save a nation if only for one more dawn. when the shield walls broke apart and the longships were hauled back onto the frostbitten shores, the men of the north did not simply vanish into silence. They returned home, or at least to the nearest semblance of home they had, to the mead halls, those great timbered sanctuaries of warmth, noise, and memory. Between raids came feasts, and between battles came stories. In those smoke-filled halls, beneath the watchful eyes of carved gods and flickering torchlight, the Viking spirit was reforged. Here, courage was not only born, it was taught, sung, and toasted into existence. The mead hall was the beating heart of the Viking world. Every settlement, from the humblest village to the court of a jarl, had one. Built of oak and pine, roofed with turf and thatch, and large enough to hold an entire community, it stood like a glowing beacon in the long darkness of winter. Smoke curled from its central hearth, thick and sweet, with the scent of burning pine and roasted meat. Shields hung on the walls like trophies, and along the rafters, the skulls of animals, elk, bear, boar, stared down from above, silent witnesses to centuries of laughter, argument, and song. Inside, the air was thick with life. Roaring fires spat embers into the dim rafters, while men shouted over one another, tankards of mead sloshing golden foam onto the floor. The benches creaked under the weight of warriors, traders, and wanderers returned from the sea, each with stories to tell. Women moved between them with platters of food-roasted lamb, salted fish, coarse bread, and butter thick as cream. Dogs prowled beneath the tables, snapping up bones tossed their way. Every sound echoed through the wooden hall. The clink of iron cups, the laughter of the drunk, the steady hum of 100 voices blending into a single human storm. The mead itself was more than drink, it was tradition, brewed from honey, water, and herbs. It was the taste of the land's sweetness, distilled through hardship. The first sip burned, the second warmed, and the third transformed. Under its influence, fear softened, memory sharpened, and courage became contagious. Every feast began the same way, with a toast to the gods, to Odin for wisdom, to Thor for strength, to Freya for love and luck. Then came toasts to the fallen, to the ancestors who watched from the halls of Valhalla, and finally, the living raised their horns to one another, to the next voyage, the next battle, the next dawn. But beneath the laughter and the bravado, the mead hall was more than a place of revelry. It was a classroom, a theater, and a temple all at once. This was where young men learned what it meant to be a warrior, long before they ever held a sword. In the flicker of the firelight, they watched their elders, men scarred by war and sea, whose voices carried both the weight of experience and the rhythm of poetry. They listened to sagas, tales of heroes and gods, of monsters slain and oaths kept. Each story was both entertainment and instruction, a moral wrapped in rhythm, a lesson buried in myth. A boy like Sigurd Bjornsson might sit at the edge of the benches, half hidden in the shadows, clutching his cup of watered-down mead. His father's axe would hang above the hearth, his edge gleaming in the firelight. As the skald, the hall's poet and keeper of memory, stood to recite, the boy would lean forward, every word sinking into him like the blows of a hammer shaping metal. The skald would begin softly, his voice weaving through the murmurs. Once there was a man named Ragnar, who sailed where no man dared, whose courage outlasted the sea itself. The hall would grow quiet, even the drunkards lowering their cups. The fire crackled, the wind moaned faintly outside. As the tale unfolded, the listeners were transported, not merely entertained, but transformed. Every victory and every tragedy became part of them, another thread in the great tapestry of what it meant to live and die as a Northman. To the uninitiated, these sagas might have sounded like boasts, and they were, in part. Every boast, every story of triumph, was a declaration of identity. But in their repetition, in their rhythm, they also became lullabies. The hall itself seemed to breathe with them, its timbers absorbing the echoes of centuries of songs. The Vikings did not read history, they spoke it into being. Their heroes were not frozen in ink, but kept alive in sound, in the rise and fall of voices, in the crash of mugs, in the beating of fists against tables. The mead hall was where reputation was built and broken. A man's words mattered here as much as his deeds. To boast too loudly was arrogance. To boast too little was cowardice. The right balance, confident but not conceited, could earn a warrior respect that followed him to his grave. Those who lied were mocked. Those who spoke truthfully of great deeds were celebrated. If a man exaggerated, there was always someone in the corner who would smirk and say, "Aye, and did the sea part for you too, cousin?" followed by a roar of laughter. Honor lived and died in those exchanges. Feasting, drinking, storytelling, all were rituals in the making of a warrior. To fight bravely was one thing, but to live bravely, to speak well, to remember well, to endure both victory and loss with the same calm that was the true measure of manhood. The hall was a forge, and the mead the fire that softened the soul enough to be shaped. And yet, amid the noise and bravado, there was tenderness too. Between the songs of blood and the tales of conquest came moments of quiet when the skald sang of the sea, of home, of the wives and children waiting by the firelight. Even the fiercest warrior, drunk on mead and glory, would fall silent then, eyes glassy with reflection. For all their ruthlessness, the Northmen were not without sentiment. They simply hid it beneath iron and laughter. In the lull between verses, a young man might catch himself wondering if he, too, would one day be sung about. Would his name travel across the waves, whispered in halls far from home? Would his deeds outlive him? Or would he vanish like so many others, a nameless shield buried in the sand? The firelight flickered across his face as he imagined it, the taste of honey wine mingling with the hunger for something greater than life itself. It was in these moments that warriors were truly made, not in the clangor of battle, but in the quiet intoxication of possibility. Glory, after all, began as a story. Every man who sailed the next raid carried not just his weapon, but the weight of every tale he had ever heard. The songs of Ragnar, the boasts of Bjorn, the laughter of men who had looked death in the eye and lived to mock it, all of it became a part of him. As the night deepened and the hall grew smoky, the songs turned slower, softer. Some men slumped against the walls, asleep with cups still in their hands. Others stared into the fire, lost in memory or anticipation. The skald's voice, hoarse now, faded into murmurs. Outside, the wind howled across the frozen plains, rattling the wooden walls. And yet inside, the warmth held a small, defiant circle of life against the endless cold. For tomorrow, they would once again be warriors, sailors, raiders, builders of shield walls and breakers of kings. But tonight, they were dreamers, poets, brothers. The surrounding hall was more than shelter. It was a womb of legend, where courage fermented with honey wine, where boys became men, and men became myths. And as Sigurd Bjornsson drifted to sleep to the sound of clinking cups and fading song, he did not dream of rest. He dreamed of fire, of sails against the dawn, of his own name carried on the wind, another verse waiting to be sung. The mead halls of the north were not only the forges of courage, they were the birthplaces of legends. And among the tales sung over firelight and honey wine, none stirred both awe and dread quite like those of the berserkers. To speak their name was to summon an image that blurred the line between man and monster, soldier and storm. They were the fury of the battlefield, given flesh bare-chested, howling, unstoppable. Men who fought as if possessed by gods or madness, whose rage seemed to burn hotter than the forge of Thor himself. To the common warrior, war was a duty, an ordeal to be endured with courage and discipline. But to the berserker, war was something else entirely, an awakening. They entered battle not as men, but as creatures transformed. Some said they fought without armor, the cold wind licking their bare skin while steel flashed around them. Others swore they chewed on their shields before combat, their eyes rolling white, their mouths foaming like wolves. When they charged, even seasoned warriors stepped aside, for to face a berserker head-on was to face death unreasoning. The old sagas say that when the fury took them, pain could not touch them. Wounds that would fell another man seemed meaningless. Blades glanced off their skin as if it were iron. Their strength doubled, their voices rose in bestial howls that carried across the field, and their enemies broke long before steel met flesh. To go berserk, the later chroniclers would write, is to lose oneself to become the storm. What made them this way? The question has echoed across centuries, tangled between history and myth. Some say it was divine possession, that Odin himself filled their veins, with the bloodlust of his own warriors, the Einherjar who fought forever in Valhalla. Others whisper of herbs and mushrooms, strange northern brews that twisted the mind and set the heart ablaze. A few speak of trance and ritual, of chants and drumming that stripped away the self until nothing remained but instinct. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. On the battlefield, they were terror incarnate. The sight of them, bare-chested and painted in ash, eyes blazing like coals, could shatter the courage of entire armies. Even their own allies feared them, for once the red mist descended, friend and foe alike could fall to their axes. The sagas tell of berserkers who fought until their hands locked around their weapons, until their muscles tore, until exhaustion claimed them and they collapsed into silence, still snarling in their sleep. But the rage did not last forever. After the storm came stillness, and that stillness was almost worse. When the fury passed, the berserker was said to fall into a deep weakness, trembling as if drained of life itself. Some slept for days, others wept, unable to remember what they had done. It was as if their souls had been borrowed by something vast and terrible, and when it departed, it left them hollow. In the Viking imagination, the berserker stood at the edge of humanity, both revered and feared. They were Odin's chosen, yet also reminders of how thin the boundary between man and beast could be. The word itself, berserker, may come from bear shirt, a reference to warriors who wore bear hides into battle, believing they could channel the spirit of the animal. Others argue it meant bear shirt, describing those who fought without armor, trusting only in their rage. Both meanings fit. For to the berserker, protection came not from steel, but from the conviction that death itself would flinch before them. They appeared in every major saga, their presence both blessing and curse. In Egil's saga, a berserker duel decides the fate of a chieftain's daughter. In the saga of the Volsungs, Sigmund and his men don wolfskins and become nearly unstoppable in combat. These stories were not exaggerations to their audiences, they were warnings. The berserker represented the raw, untamable force that lay within every man, the thin line between bravery and savagery. On the battlefield, they were nightmares you did not wake from. When their howls rose over the clash of weapons, even the bravest foes faltered. The sound was not human, it was animal, primal, a reminder of the chaos that lay beneath the thin skin of civilization. To hear that scream in the fog, to see the gleam of an axe swinging in the first light of dawn, it was enough to turn hardened soldiers into fleeing men. And yet, there was something magnetic about them, something that drew both admiration and envy. Every young warrior secretly wondered what it would feel like to lose all fear, to become pure force, to fight with such abandon that death itself felt like a victory. The berserkers embodied what others only dared to dream: the complete surrender of self to purpose. They were the living proof that courage, when pushed far enough, became something monstrous and divine all at once. Their existence raised uncomfortable questions for the society that celebrated them. In peace, what place was there for such men? A berserker in battle was a weapon. In the hall, he was a danger. Many sagas tell of berserkers who turned their fury against their own kin, unable to control the fire that consumed them. Some became outlaws, living in the wilds like wolves, half worshipped, half feared. Others were kept close by kings, prized as bodyguards and champions, unleashed only when blood needed spilling. Over time, as Christianity crept north and the gods of the old world began to fade, the berserkers became figures of superstition, relics of a pagan past. The church called their fury demonic, their trances a form of possession. To go berserk was no longer divine, it was cursed. The once glorious storm was recast as sin, and the men who once stood at the front of armies now vanished into legend. But the myth endured. Even centuries later, the echo of their name lingered in language and story. To go berserk became a saying, a phrase to describe losing control, surrendering to rage. But in its truest sense, the berserker's frenzy was not chaos, it was clarity. To them, battle stripped away illusion. There was no past, no future, no fear, only the now, the heartbeat, the swing of the axe. In that single, terrible focus lay their power. The few artifacts linked to them, bear claws, wolf teeth, fragments of fur-lined cloaks, still carry that aura. Archaeologists debate, historians theorize, but the truth remains elusive. half buried beneath soil and song. Were they real men, altered by ritual and madness? Or were they symbols, poetic exaggerations of what courage could become when it forgot reason? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere between, for even in myth, there is always a seed of truth. Every culture, at the edge of war, produces those who fight beyond fear, who lose themselves in the moment and become something more or less than human. The Berserkers were the North's version of that eternal story. Their fury born of cold, hunger, and faith in gods who demanded sacrifice. To face one was to look into the eyes of that story and to see, reflected there, the truth that terrified even the bravest Viking, that inside every man lies a storm waiting to break. They were half man, half myth, walking contradictions of flesh and legend. On the field, they were fire made flesh. Off it, they were ghosts of their own making. And though time has blurred their faces, their echo remains a growl in the wind, a tremor in the blood, a reminder that the line between man and monster has never truly been erased. The Berserkers were not heroes, nor were they demons. They were something older, something deeper, the embodiment of humanity's oldest instinct: to fight, to survive, to surrender to the wildness that civilization can only ever pretend to forget. And when they howled into the dawn, it was not rage alone that filled their throats, but the song of the storm itself, the voice of the North, raw and eternal, screaming to be remembered. When the Berserkers' howls finally faded into the smoke of memory, another sound rose softly from the North, not the roar of rage, but the whisper of defiance. It came not from the longships or the mead halls, but from hearths and hillsides, where women watched their sons, brothers, and husbands vanish into the sea and did not wait idly for their return. The sagas of the Norse told stories of such women, shield maidens. They were called fierce, unyielding, and free. They stood beside men in battle, their braids stiff with frost, their hands steady upon the hilts of swords. Some said they fought for vengeance, others for glory, and others still because no one else remained to defend what they loved. Whether myth or truth, their stories became as enduring as the iron they carried. In the old tales recited by firelight, shield maidens strode across the battlefield like living storms. Names such as Brynhildr, Lagertha, and Freydis Eriksdottir were whispered with reverence, women whose courage rivaled that of kings. They rode horses into battle, their mail glinting in the cold sun, their voices rising above the clash of weapons. They fought like wolves, one monk wrote bitterly of the Norse invaders, and some among them were women, monstrous in strength, with no fear of death. To the enemies of the North, they were proof that the Vikings broke every law, even those of nature. To their own people, they were something rarer, still proof that courage belonged to no single gender, that valor was not born of muscle but of spirit. For centuries, scholars treated these women as fantasy. The shield maiden, they said, was a poetic invention, a symbol of the North's wildness, a metaphor for untamed strength. Real women, historians once insisted, did not fight. They stayed home, weaving stories rather than swinging swords. But time, as always, had other truths buried beneath the soil. In 1889, on the Swedish island of Birka, archaeologists unearthed a Viking grave, a grand one, filled with a sword, an axe, 2 shields, a spear, and a full set of gaming pieces, symbols of command and strategy. For over a century, everyone assumed the warrior buried there was male. Only in recent years, when DNA testing was performed, did the truth emerge. The skeleton was female. Her bones told a quiet but undeniable story, one of a woman who had lived as a fighter, buried as a leader, remembered as a myth. That discovery shattered the certainty of generations. It blurred the neat lines drawn by historians, forcing them to reconsider what had long been dismissed as legend. Perhaps the sagas had not exaggerated after all. Perhaps, somewhere between the gods and ghosts of their stories, the truth had simply been waiting, patient, silent, and unyielding, like the women themselves. Imagine her, that woman of Birka. Her grave sits above a northern fjord, where the wind sings through the grass and the water glints like hammered steel. The weapons at her side are not ornaments. They are companions, worn smooth by use. The sword's edge, dulled by time, once cut through air and flesh alike. The shield, painted once in bright color, now bears the memory of blows struck and taken. Around her lie the bones of her horse, buried to carry her into the afterlife. She was not just someone's wife or daughter, she was her own legend. The Norse world was harsh and unsparing, and in such a world, necessity often outweighed convention. When raids claimed the men or winter starved the settlements, women took up arms. They defended their farms, their children, their gods. Some followed their kin onto the longships, crossing seas to fight or trade. The sagas speak of Lagertha, who led troops into battle beside Ragnar Lodbrok, her hair streaming like sunlight, her courage unmatched. The chronicler Saxo Grammaticus, who clearly found the notion unsettling, described her as a woman with the heart of a man. But perhaps he misunderstood. She did not need the heart of a man. She had her own. Courage, after all, had never cared about gender. It burned the same in every soul that dared to defy fear. The shield maidens of the North may not have been common, but they were real enough to leave echoes in history's bones. And for everyone whose name was recorded, there were dozens more who lived and died unnamed, who picked up axes when no one else could, who fought not for glory but for survival. In the sagas, even the gods mirrored this truth. Freya, goddess of love, also received half the slain from the battlefield, her hall, Folkvanger, sharing with Odin's Valhalla the souls of the brave. The women of the North worshipped a goddess who could be both gentle and ruthless, tender and terrifying. It is no wonder, then, that some of them saw no contradiction in wielding both spindle and sword. Life in the Viking Age demanded both. Those who doubted the shield maiden's existence pointed to the lack of written records, but the Vikings did not write their history. They lived it, and they sang it. Their stories were carved not on parchment but on memory, passed from mouth to mouth, from hall to hall. When a skald recited the deeds of a shield maiden, he was not simply spinning fantasy, he was preserving identity. The tale of Brynhildr or Freydis was not meant to be precise history. It was meant to remind those listening that courage had many faces. Freydis, in particular, stands as one of the most striking. In the sagas of Vinland, the Viking voyages to North America, she is described as fierce and ruthless. When attacked by natives, she took up a sword and fought while the men fled. Pregnant and unarmored, she bared her breast and struck her blade against it, shouting for her enemies to face her. Terrified, they retreated. Was it true? Perhaps not entirely. But truth is often less important than what a people choose to believe about themselves. To the Norse, Freydis embodied defiance, the refusal to yield even in the face of death. The image of the shield maiden endured long after the Viking Age faded. In medieval Europe, she was transformed into the Amazon of northern myth, the warrior maiden of chivalric romance. In later centuries, she became a figure of nostalgia, a reminder that even in an age of men, women had once walked beside them as equals in war. Her ghost haunted poetry, art, and song. And in the modern world, when archaeologists brushed the dirt from that grave in Berka, it was as if her spirit had stirred again, reminding us that history's silence was not proof of absence. In truth, the Viking Age was an era where everyone, in some way, was at war not only with enemies, but with the land, the sea, the cold, and fate itself. To survive required strength of body and will, and the women of the North possessed both. They were farmers, healers, traders, mothers, and occasionally, when the times demanded, warriors. The same wind that filled the sails of longships swept across their fields and hearths, shaping them with the same relentless hand. When the sagas speak of shield maidens, they are not just telling stories of battle, they are telling stories of endurance. Of those who held the world together while others tried to break it apart. Of those who stood in the shadow of gods and refused to be silent. And so, myth blurred into memory, and memory into truth. The women of the North Wind may not have worn their swords every day, but they carried their courage always, a quiet, constant strength that outlasted the storms. Even silence, in their world, was a kind of battle. Picture now that hall again, the same one where men feasted and sang. The firelight dances across the faces of warriors, and among them, a woman sits, her hair braided with silver rings, her eyes like ice and flame. She listens, perhaps, to a skald singing of battles she herself remembers. No one questions her place there. She earned it, and when the song ends, she raises her horn and drinks not to glory, not to men, but to the enduring truth that courage, like the northern wind, belongs to all who dare to breathe it. In the end, the Shield Maidens remind us that history is not only written by victors, but by survivors, and survival in any age is its own kind of heroism. The legends of the Shield Maidens, of fierce men and women carved from ice and salt, had long filled the northern winds with stories of courage and defiance. Yet for those who lived to the south in the cloisters, castles, and chapels of early medieval England, those same winds carried something darker. It began as rumor, then as memory, and finally as a waking nightmare. When the North came, it came not as mere raiders or wanderers, but as a revelation, one that would shake the very foundations of faith. For the people of Christian England, the Vikings were not simply men from another land. They were a message from heaven, or perhaps from hell. In the year 793, the monks of Lindisfarne had written with trembling hands, "The blood of saints poured around the altar. The house of God, splattered with the blood of priests, stripped bare of its treasures." Those words spread like wildfire through monasteries and royal courts alike, carried by riders and priests, whispered from pulpits to peasants. For centuries, the church had preached that England was a land favored by God, protected by prayer and piety. Yet now, that illusion lay broken on a northern shore, its holy island blackened by smoke and littered with bodies. Letters from terrified abbots and bishops reached far beyond Northumbria. Some begged Rome for aid, others warned of divine wrath. One chronicler described fiery dragons seen flying in the sky above the coast, their wings glowing red as blood, an omen, they said, of what was to come. Superstition and scripture became indistinguishable. The apocalypse felt close enough to touch, and as the news spread south, so did the fear. In villages and cities, bells rang not for worship, but for warning. The coastlines bristled with panic. Churches began to fortify themselves, their stone walls growing thicker, their doors reinforced with iron. Kings and lords, desperate to protect what remained, ordered watchtowers raised along the shores. From Northumbria to Wessex, from East Anglia to Mercia, men began to scan the horizon for shapes that might have been clouds or might have been sails. But walls could not keep out fear. The monks prayed, the kings armed themselves, and still the dread lingered, a slow, suffocating certainty that something unstoppable had awoken in the north. It was not simply that the Vikings killed. Many invaders had done that before. It was the way they came, silent, sudden, merciless, as if conjured from the mist itself. One day the sea was empty, and the next it was alive with dragon-proud ships. They struck at dawn, when the world was at its most vulnerable, and by nightfall they were gone again, leaving behind fire, ashes, and the echo of screams carried on the tide. To the medieval mind, there was only one explanation: punishment. The age of faith had met an age of fire. Priests told their frightened congregations that the raids were God's judgment for sin, for pride, for greed, for the corruption of kings, and the faithlessness of the people. Every monastery that burned was proof that heaven had turned its face away. The Vikings were not seen as men at all, but as divine instruments, scourges sent to remind Christendom of its weakness. "They are the sons of Cain," one abbot wrote. "They come not for gold, but for our souls." And yet, in truth, the Vikings sought only survival, food, silver, and land. But to those who watched their world unravel, such practical reasons were invisible. Myth consumed reality. The invaders' pale hair, their strange armor, their ferocity in battle, all became symbols of the otherworldly. They seemed less like raiders and more like demons who had climbed out of the sea. Their longships, the chariots of damnation. Even their timing felt uncanny. They struck not just in times of weakness, but in moments of supposed holiness. They burned monasteries during Lent, desecrated churches on feast days, slaughtered priests before the altar. To those who survived, this could not have been coincidence, it was mockery. And mockery of God was the greatest terror of all. The panic reached even the courts of kings. In Wessex, rulers who once warred with one another now turned their attention northward, uniting not out of ambition, but out of desperation. Yet even unity seemed fragile against such a threat. How do you fight men who vanish with the tide? How do you defend a faith from what feels like its own reckoning? The scribes of the time described the coming of the Northmen as if describing a plague, unstoppable, inexplicable, ordained. They rise from the sea, wrote the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and they take what they wish, as if no man or angel can stand against them. The same chroniclers who once filled their pages with genealogies of saints now filled them with laments. The sacred ink that had once preserved psalms now recorded despair. For the monks who survived, the trauma was more than physical. Many began to question what their faith meant in a world that allowed such horror. The monasteries, once sanctuaries of peace, became prisons of dread. Every creak of a door, every gust of wind through a shutter, could be mistaken for the sound of oars. And when new raids struck at Jarrow, at Iona, at Whitby, that fear hardened into something colder: resignation. The language of prayer shifted too. The old hymns of praise gave way to pleas for mercy. "Deliver us, O Lord, from the fury of the Northmen," became a refrain whispered in every chapel, a prayer that crossed kingdoms, spoken by peasants and bishops alike. But even as the words spread, so did the silence of unanswered faith. The Vikings kept coming. To the English chroniclers, it felt as though heaven itself had gone silent. God no longer intervened, no longer shielded his servants from fire or sword. The world had grown indifferent, or worse, had turned its face toward chaos. The Viking Age was not just a military crisis, it was a spiritual one. In the space of a few years, the certainty of divine protection, the very backbone of medieval belief, had cracked. And yet, within that fear, something else began to stir: a grim understanding that faith alone could no longer suffice. The church began to adapt. Monks became masons, fortifying abbeys into stone redoubts. Kings learned from their enemies, building fleets to patrol their coasts. The Vikings had come as punishment, but their very presence forced the kingdoms of England to evolve, to harden, to become something new. Still, the fear never left. Even centuries later, when the raids had ceased and the Northmen had settled, their memory remained a scar on the Christian imagination. They were remembered not as conquerors or colonizers, but as omens, reminders that faith, left complacent, could be shaken to its knees. In art and scripture, they lingered as figures of warning. Illuminated manuscripts showed dragon-prowed ships emerging from black seas, angels weeping above burning churches. In sermons, preachers spoke of the wrath of God carried on the tide, of the need for repentance before the next storm came. Even as trade and peace returned, the echo of those first raids haunted the land. The age of faith had indeed met an age of fire, and though the flames eventually dimmed, their glow remained. The Vikings had shown the kingdoms of Britain a truth they had long denied: that no wall, no prayer, no promise could hold back the sea forever. The tide always comes, and when it does, it washes away even the holiest illusions. For those who lived through that terror, the world would never feel secure again. And for those who came after, the story of the Northmen became a parable of fear, of faith, and of the fragile line that divides the two. The monks' letters still survive, their ink faded but their anguish unforgotten. "The blood of saints poured around the altar," one wrote, as if trying to explain the unexplainable. But perhaps no explanation was ever needed. The message was clear enough. The heavens had fallen silent, and in that silence, men learned to endure. The Christian world had seen its gods tested, its churches burned, its faith shaken. Yet, in the ashes of that fear, something unexpected endured: not triumph, not peace, but resilience. The bells would ring again, though never quite the same. And as they did, their sound carried both a warning and a memory, that even the holiest light must sometimes pass through fire before it learns to shine again. The smoke of burning monasteries had hardly faded from the northern sky when England began to learn a new kind of survival, not through swords or prayer, but through silver. The Vikings had come with fire, and the church had met them with faith. Yet neither fire nor faith could hold the tide forever. And so, by the 10th century, a new word entered the English tongue: Danegeld. It meant Danish money, but everyone understood what it truly was: a ransom, a protection fee, a desperate bargain struck with the storm itself. At first, the payments were whispered, almost shameful. Kings, bishops, and nobles called it tribute or gifts of peace, as though the word could soften its humiliation. But the meaning was plain. The Vikings would arrive in their longships, their oars slicing through the gray water like knives, their shields glinting in the pale sunday, And when they did, the rulers of England faced two choices: resist and burn, or pay and survive. The silver flowed, and so did the blood. For the two were often inseparable. The first great payment came in 991, after the Battle of Malden, when the English ealdorman Bertnoth and his men were cut down by a Viking army near the Blackwater estuary. It was a slaughter remembered in poetry and shame. The surviving English, terrified and leaderless, sent messengers to the Viking camp. What did the Northmen want? Not land, not prisoner silver, 11,000 pounds of it. The chroniclers recorded the amount with disbelief. Never before had such wealth been handed over to invaders so freely. But the promise was simple: take the money, leave our shores. Of course, they didn't leave. They came back, as anyone would who had just discovered that England could be persuaded to pay for its own survival. The logic was cruel, and brilliant violence turned into business. The Vikings had learned that they didn't always need to burn a town to profit from it. They just needed to threaten to. Like a blacksmith turning iron into gold, they had found a way to turn fear into silver. The payments grew, from 11,000 ounces to 22,000 to 36,000, until by the early 11th century, under King Ethelred, later remembered with bleak irony, as Ethelred, the unready England, was bleeding silver by the ton. In 20 years, the total tribute reached an almost impossible sum: 650,000 ounces of silver. To put it in perspective, that was more wealth than most kingdoms had ever seen in their lifetimes. The fields of England had become mines not of ore, but of coin. The peasants plowed, the tacksmen gathered, and the king sent the silver north, all to buy a peace that never truly lasted. Historians would later call it extortion. The sagas would call it cleverness. But the people who lived through it simply called it survival. The Danegeld was less a policy than a ritual, a grim ceremony repeated again and again, each payment an act of submission disguised as diplomacy. Kings justified it as pragmatism. Better to lose silver than souls. Better to buy peace than bury another village. But peace, like all things bought in fear, came with conditions. Once a town paid, the Vikings would mark it as a safe harbor. But if that town delayed or faltered in its tribute, the fire returned. To those who resisted, the Danegeld was not mercy, it was mockery. "We are not conquered," one chronicler wrote bitterly, "but we pay tribute as though we were slaves." The English knew what they were doing, yet they could see no other choice. They had neither the unity nor the courage to fight a people who moved like ghosts across the sea. In some ways, the Danegeld was a kind of genius, brutal, effective, self-perpetuating. It turned war into economics, pillage into policy. The Vikings became businessmen with swords, negotiating contracts written in blood. The sums were so vast that English silver began to reshape the northern world. Hoards found in Denmark and Norway, buried in pots, packed in cloth, hidden beneath hearthstones, glitter even today with English coins. The faces of English kings, stamped in silver, traveled farther than any envoy or prayer ever did. But there was a darker brilliance to it too. Each payment made the next one inevitable. The Vikings had discovered that fear was the most renewable resource of all. "We can buy peace," the English told themselves, even as they knew the truth that every coin spent on peace only purchased a more expensive war. It was, in essence, protection money. Britain, some would later say, invented the mafia long before Italy ever dreamed of it. The Viking leaders, pragmatic as ever, treated it like a contract. They kept their word for a time. When they promised to leave a region unburned in exchange for silver, they often did. But the sea was wide, and loyalty was thin. What one warlord swore, another broke. Soon, rival Viking bands competed to see who could extract the richest tribute, the same way traders might compete for markets. England became less a kingdom and more a market of fear, and business was good. For the kings of England, the Danegeld became both weapon and curse. It bought time, but not stability. King Ethelred, tormented by his failures, grew increasingly paranoid. He replaced advisors, purged nobles, and even ordered the massacre of all Danes living in England, an act that would ignite even greater fury from across the sea. His own people began to lose faith in him. "He buys peace," one poem mocked, "as a coward buys silence." And yet, who could blame him? The Viking fleets were relentless, sometimes hundreds of ships at once, their sails blotting out the horizon. Each crew demanded payment, each leader a promise. Ethelred was drowning in silver, his treasury emptying faster than it could be filled. The very coin minted for trade and prosperity now bought only temporary survival. But while the English grew poorer, the Vikings grew richer and more organized. With their newfound wealth, they built permanent bases, fortresses, and winter camps across the English coast. The Danegeld, meant to keep them away, instead anchored them more firmly than ever. The invaders who had once come for loot began to stay for land. The wealth of England became the seed of its own occupation. By the time the payments reached their peak, the line between invader and neighbor had blurred. Viking kings ruled parts of England outright, collecting taxes just as the English once had. The Danegeld no longer came as tribute, it came as law. The same silver that had once been ransomed to keep the Northmen away now paid their wages, their fleets, their settlements. The Vikings had transformed from raiders into rulers, their axes replaced by ledgers. And still, the English paid. Because by then, they were paying not just for peace, but for normalcy, for the illusion that life could continue under foreign rule, that the tides of history could somehow be bribed into calm. But tides do not bargain. The legacy of the Danegeld would endure long after the last coin was spent. It became a warning, written in history, and echoed centuries later by poets and kings alike. Once you pay the Danegeld, you never get rid of the Dane. Every ransom, every act of appeasement, no matter how reasonable it seemed, only invited more demands. And yet, perhaps the story is not only one of failure, it is also a story of adaptation, of a people learning, through humiliation and loss, that survival often demands compromise. The Vikings, for all their ferocity, had forced England to evolve. The same kings who once begged for peace would one day raise fleets to fight back. The lessons bought in silver would eventually be repaid in iron. But for now, in those uneasy years, when the ink of treaties had barely dried before new sails appeared on the horizon, England lived in the shadow of its own payments. The church still prayed, the peasants still toiled, and the silver still vanished northward like water into sand. Peace, in those days, was not a gift. It was a transaction. And every man, from the humblest farmer to the king himself, knew the truth that no priest dared speak aloud, that England's faith could not yet save it, but its silver just might. And so the Danegeld flowed, bright, heavy, endless, a river of fear and necessity, glinting in the dim light of a kingdom that had learned, too late, that survival has its price. The silver had flowed north for decades, a glittering river of fear that England could not stem. But as time passed, that river began to take root. What began as the gleam of plunder slowly became the glimmer of settlement. The Viking Age, that long, roaring storm that had begun with the raid on Lindisfarne, started to change its shape. The men who had once arrived with axes and torches began to lay down their weapons, not out of mercy, but out of practicality. There were only so many towns left to burn, so many monasteries left to sack. The land they had once ravaged began to look less like a target and more like a home. By the dawn of the 10th century, the wild chaos of raids was giving way to something new, a strange, uneasy peace that had not been bought with silver this time, but with familiarity. Viking camps became villages. Villages became towns. The names we know now, York, Dublin, Lincoln, Norwich, were once Norse footholds, born from encampments of weary seafarers who had decided that perhaps it was better to sow fields than corpses. York became Jorvik, the great Viking capital of northern England, its streets crowded not with soldiers but with traders and craftsmen. Dublin, once a temporary harbor for slave traders and pirates, grew into a bustling port, a northern crossroad of goods, gossip, and gods. The Northmen were adapting, as they always had. They had learned that conquest by fire could only last so long, but conquest by culture, by trade, by marriage, by language could last forever. In what came to be called the Danelaw, vast swathes of eastern and northern England fell under Scandinavian rule, not by decree or royal edict, but by custom. Here, Viking law governed daily life. Viking words shaped daily speech, and Viking blood mingled with English in every village. The boundaries between raider and resident blurred until no one could clearly tell the difference. The same men who had once torched monasteries now married English women, raised children who spoke two tongues, and tilled the same fields their fathers had once pillaged. Intermarriage softened the edges of conquest. The grandchildren of raiders became farmers, traders, even Christians. The sons of Englishmen bore Norse names. The daughters of Norsemen sang English lullabies. And with this quiet merging came trade. Where once there had been ash and ruin, there were now Sunday markets. On the same soil where blood had run, now lay barrels of salted fish, bundles of wool, and baskets of amber and silver. Ships that once carried warriors now carried goods, timber from Norway, furs from Sweden, silk and spices from the east. The long ships still glided up the rivers, but their cargo had changed. Their sails no longer announced terror, they promised trade. The English chroniclers, always slow to forgive, began to speak less of the fury of the Northmen and more of the merchants from the Danelaw. They were still wary. Of course, centuries of fear do not vanish easily, but they could not deny what they saw. The invaders were settling, and with them came prosperity. Towns grew, markets flourished, and England, though still divided, began to hum with a new kind of life. And as trade grew, so did language. The English tongue, a patchwork already of Celtic and Latin and Saxon, now absorbed Norse like a river, taking in another stream. Words that were once foreign became natural. Sky, egg, knife, window, anger, law, husband, happy. Even simple, enduring words, take, get, want, came from the north. It was as if the Vikings, having failed to conquer the land completely, conquered the language instead. Every time a farmer shouted to his neighbor about the weather, every time a wife called her husband in from the cold, they spoke a little bit of the Old Norse world without realizing it. The transformation was not sudden, nor was it peaceful. There were still skirmishes, still betrayals and uprisings, still blood spilled between kingdoms, but the tide of violence had begun to ebb. The Vikings, who had once lived by the sword, were now living by the plow and the coin. They built houses of timber and stone, raised churches beside the old pagan altars, and buried their dead not as invaders but as ancestors. In Jorvik, the scent of tar and fish mixed with that of incense and bread. Craftsmen carved combs from bone and pendants from amber. Coins bearing Norse runes mingled with those stamped with the cross. Merchants from as far as Byzantium passed through, trading silk for iron, spices for hides. The Viking age of war was quietly becoming an age of connection. The sea that had once carried destruction now carried exchange ideas, stories, and people flowing both ways. Even the laws of England bent to this new reality. The word Danelaw did not mean mere geography. It meant coexistence. Within its boundaries, Norse law prevailed, its emphasis on compensation over punishment, on practical justice rather than divine judgment. If a man was wronged, he was paid. If a life was taken, a fine was set. To English ears, it seemed almost civilized, pragmatic in a way their own systems had not been. Over time, these customs blended, shaping the foundation of the common law that would one day rule the whole island. Yet beneath this slow transformation lay something deeper, a change not only in society, but in the Viking spirit itself. The generation that had once sought glory and fire and plunder now found it in endurance. The sagas began to change tone, no longer just tales of distant raids and doomed heroes. They began to tell of homes, of farms, of journeys that ended not in battle but in belonging. The North had discovered that permanence, too, was a kind of victory. Of course, not all welcomed this peace. There were still those who longed for the old days, who whispered that the gods of Asgard had been betrayed by the cross, that the sea was calling them to raid once more. But for most, the hunger for conquest had dimmed. The world was changing, and even the fiercest warriors had to change with it. By the late 10th century, the Viking Age had entered its twilight. The longships still cut across the horizon, but now they carried settlers more often than soldiers. Families moved south to claim farmland, not fortresses. And those who stayed in Scandinavia began to hear news from across the sea of cousins and brothers who had built towns, taken wives, and grown old under English suns. The irony was not lost on anyone. The invaders had stopped raiding mostly because there was nowhere left to raid. Their enemies had become their neighbors. Their battlefields had become their fields, and the same hands that had once raised axes now lifted their children instead. When the monks of Lindisfarne had first seen the longships gliding out of the mist, they had written of the end of the world. But perhaps, in a quieter way, what came after was a kind of beginning. Out of the smoke and ruin of those early centuries rose something unexpected, a new culture, woven from two worlds that had once hated each other. And so the story turned from terror to tolerance, from fire to family. The Vikings, who had once been the scourge of Christendom, became part of its fabric. Their gods faded, their axes dulled, but their legacy endured not as conquerors, but as ancestors. In the markets of York, you could hear both languages, sometimes even in the same breath. A Norse trader haggling over wool with an English farmer, a priest blessing a newborn with a name that belonged to both faiths. The air itself seemed to hum with a strange harmony, the kind that can only be born out of centuries of chaos. The longships still slept in the harbors, their dragon heads carved and silent, their sails folded like wings at rest. The sea no longer thundered with war, it whispered instead, softly, carrying the memory of all that had been the cries of battle, the clash of steel, the songs of feasts, the laughter of children. And somewhere along those quiet shores of the Danelaw, the north finally exhaled no longer a storm, but a steady wind, weaving its story into the land it had once set aflame. The sound of the sea had always been the heartbeat of the north, restless, rhythmic, eternal. For centuries it had carried warriors and storms, longships and legends, but by the mid-11th century, that heartbeat began to quiet. The dragon ships still rocked in their harbors, but the songs of war had grown faint. The world had changed, and the North, for all its ferocity, had changed with it. The great age of the Vikings, the age that had once sent tremors across Europe, was fading, not with a final battle, but with a sigh. For nearly 3 centuries, the Norsemen had ruled the waves. Their ships had reached from the coasts of North America to the deserts of Arabia, from the icy fjords of Greenland to the warm sands of Sicily. They had raided, traded, conquered, and settled, carving their names into the bones of the world. But even storms cannot rage forever. The men who once measured their worth in silver and slaughter now found themselves living in kingdoms that prized peace, prayer, and profit instead. By the middle of the 11th century, the map of Europe looked very different. Strong monarchies had begun to rise: England, Norway, Denmark, France, each ruled not by wandering warlords but by kings who preferred crowns to helmets. The Viking spirit that had once flourished in the lawless spaces between empires now found itself hemmed in by order. Centralized rule brought stability, and stability was the death of chaos. Where there had once been dozens of chieftains, each hungry for glory and gold, there were now organized states with standing armies, written laws, and bureaucracies that made raiding less profitable and far more dangerous. Christianity, too, had worked its quiet transformation. The old gods Odin, Thor, Freya, who had once demanded courage and blood, now stood silent before the cross. The conversion of Scandinavia did not happen in a single moment, nor did it come without resistance. But by the 11th century, the North was undeniably Christian in name and, increasingly, in heart. The churches rose where the temples once stood. Bells replaced war horns. The sagas that once sang of Valhalla now shared parchment with psalms. The young men who might have once sailed for glory were now taught to seek salvation instead. There were practical reasons for this transformation, too. The church brought literacy, alliances, and legitimacy. A king who was baptized was not just blessed by God, he was recognized by other Christian monarchs as part of the civilized order. The North discovered that faith could buy what force could not: peace, trade, and respect. And for a people as pragmatic as the Vikings, that was reason enough to bow their heads, if not in devotion, then in calculation. Prosperity dulled the blade that war had once sharpened. Trade routes flourished where raid routes had been. Towns like Bergen, Trondheim, and Ribe filled with merchants, not marauders. The same seas that had once carried dragon-proud longships now bore merchant cogs laden with furs, iron, fish, and grain. The Viking spirit of exploration did not die. It simply found new purpose. Sailors who might once have followed the trail of smoke from burning villages now followed the scent of spice and silver instead. And so, slowly, The roar of the north softened. The longships, once the terror of Europe, became relics of a bygone age, still revered, still built with pride, but more for ceremony than conquest. Where once their sails had caught the wind of destiny, they now hung still in the harbors, their dragons sleeping beneath layers of salt and dust. The Norse world had grown tired of war, or perhaps, as the jest went, it had simply discovered better beer. Feasting, after all, had always been their second favorite pastime after fighting. And in the warmth of mead halls that no longer echoed with war chants, men began to prefer stories of old battles to the experience of new ones. They drank to the past, toasted to peace, and boasted of ancestors who had seen the world and returned a luxury that few of the early Vikings had ever known. Yet, even in peace, the old spirit lingered, faint but unforgotten. It lived in the sagas still sung by skalds beside crackling fires, in the carvings of ships on gravestones, in the whispered prayers of sailors who still feared the sea's moods. The children who grew up in this quieter age listened to those stories as if they were fairy tales, half believing, half doubting that their grandfathers had ever been so fierce. And perhaps that was how the Viking Age truly ended, not when the raids stopped, but when the memory of them began to soften into legend. In England, too, the transformation was complete. The Danelaw faded into law. Viking blood mingled with Anglo-Saxon, Norman, and Celtic, until no one could untangle its threads. The invaders had become part of the very world they once threatened to destroy. When William the Conqueror himself, descended from Norsemen, invaded England in 1066, the final echo of the Viking Age resounded across the Channel. It was not the beginning of a new raid, but the closing of a circle. The descendants of raiders had returned as kings, and so the North fell silent. The sea that had once borne its fury now carried pilgrims, traders, and missionaries. The same ships that had once landed warriors now ferried monks to distant shores. Even the weather seemed calmer, as if the gods themselves had finally grown weary. The age of axes and oaths was over. The age of altars and alliances had begun. In the sagas, the end is never a single moment, it is a fading, like twilight sliding into night. The last of the great Viking kings, Harald Hardrada, fell at Stamford Bridge in 1066. His army crushed, his ambition undone. Some say that when he died, the gods themselves wept, for with him fell the last heartbeat of the old world. After that day, there would be no more great raids, no more dragon ships blazing against the horizon, only silence, and the hum of church bells rolling across the northern hills. But perhaps that silence was not an ending so much as a transformation. The Vikings had not vanished. They had evolved. Their blood flowed through the veins of kings and peasants alike. Their words shaped languages. Their craftsmanship adorned churches. Their laws molded nations. The sea, once their battlefield, had become their bridge. When the wind swept across the fjords in those later centuries, it carried faint echoes of the past, the clash of swords, the creak of oars, the roar of men who had once defied gods and kings alike. Yet those echoes no longer summoned fear. They were reminders. The North had laid down its weapons, but not its soul. The dragon ships still watched from carvings on wood and stone, their eyes unblinking, their jaws open in frozen defiance. They seemed to ask a silent question. Was peace truly victory, or merely another kind of surrender? Perhaps both. For in the end, every age must choose what it values more, the glory of conquest, or the endurance of legacy. By the mid-11th century, the answer was clear. The North had chosen to endure. And so the fires of the Viking Age, which had once lit the world in terror and awe, dimmed to embers warm, steady, and eternal. The sea that once carried raiders now carried traders and pilgrims. The roar of the dragon ships faded into the hum of church bells once more. And in that quiet, the story of the Vikings did not end. It simply became something else, a memory carried on the wind, a song half forgotten but never lost, echoing still across the endless, dreaming waters of the North Sea. The hum of the church bells had replaced the roar of the dragon ships, but silence never truly falls over history. It only changes its tone. Centuries passed, and the longships became legends. The warriors became myths, and the fires that once terrified kingdoms cooled into the soft glow of memory. Yet beneath the calm surface of Britain and Ireland, beneath its fields, towns, and rivers, the legacy of the Vikings never disappeared. It lingered quietly, like the sea mist that rolls in from the north unseen, but ever present. When archaeologists first began to dig into the soil of Old England, they did not expect to find the north still sleeping there. But they did. Beneath the foundations of churches, beneath the cobbled streets of cities that once trembled at their arrival, they uncovered traces, broken brooches, worn coins, pieces of iron, fragments of carved bone. They found the shapes of longhouses buried beneath modern cottages, the remnants of ship burials beneath farmland, the ashes of forgotten hearths where Norse and Anglo-Saxon families had once shared the same fire. What had once been called invasion had, in time, become integration. The Vikings had not vanished, they had blended. Modern DNA maps tell a quiet story their sagas never did, that Viking blood still flows through the veins of Britain and Ireland. From the highlands of Scotland to the river valleys of Yorkshire, from Dublin's harbours to the shores of Wales, traces of Scandinavian ancestry ripple through generations like an echo of the sea. The descendants of raiders became the ancestors of farmers, builders, kings, and scholars. The North, in its own way, had conquered eternity not by fire, but by blood. But their legacy was never only biological. It was linguistic, artistic, and deeply human. The Vikings left behind not just genes, but words, sturdy, useful ones. Like planks in a ship's hull, they gave English some of its simplest, most essential terms. Sky, egg, law, window, husband, anger, words born of weather, of work, of living close to the sea and closer still to hardship. They didn't just borrow language, they shaped how the island spoke about life itself. Even the rhythm of English, with its blunt consonants and rolling vowels, carries something of the Norse cadence, strong, direct, enduring. Their art, too, endures, carved in wood, metal, and stone. The twisting, interlocking patterns of Viking design still appear in the corners of ancient churches and the engravings of old manuscripts. Their dragons, their serpents, their endless knots, all of them symbols of movement, of life eternal and ever-changing. To look at a Viking carving is to see the way they saw the world, not as something still and silent, but as a tide, forever flowing between beginnings and ends. Their ships, those long, elegant vessels that once darkened the horizon, were perhaps their greatest creation. Even centuries after the last one had sailed, the principles of their design endured. The longship was not just a tool of war, it was a masterpiece of engineering, light enough to lift, strong enough to cross oceans, and swift enough to outrun death itself. The same knowledge of wood and wind that once carried raiders now carried traders, explorers, and pilgrims. Without those ships, Europe might never have reached the edges of the known world, and beyond them. But perhaps the truest legacy of the Vikings was not in what they built, or spoke, or carved, it was in what they taught. For all their savagery, for all their blood and fire, they carried with them a lesson that outlived their swords: resilience. The Vikings understood what it meant to endure, to adapt, to rebuild. Their world was one of endless hardship, short summers, long winters, uncertain seas, yet they did not surrender to it. They turned adversity into adventure. When the land grew poor, they sailed. When their gods grew silent, they listened to new ones. When their enemies grew strong, they learned to trade instead of raid. It was this resilience, this refusal to yield to despair, that Britain inherited most deeply. The island that had once prayed for deliverance from the north eventually learned from it. The Viking sense of endurance, of practical strength, of meeting life not with complaint but with action, seeped into the English character as surely as their blood did. It became part of the cultural fabric, invisible but unmistakable like the grain of oak beneath the varnish. And so, in the long arc of history, the Vikings changed Britain not by destroying it, but by becoming part of it. Their presence reshaped the island from within. The boundaries of kingdoms shifted, the laws evolved, the language absorbed their words, and the people, knowingly or not, absorbed their spirit. To this day, when the British speak of weathering the storm, they echo the philosophy of the North, that storms are not things to fear, but to face. The old chroniclers, who once wrote of divine punishment and heathen fury, could not have imagined how quietly the story would turn. The invaders became ancestors. The destroyers became builders. The symbols of terror became emblems of identity. The dragon heads that once glared from ship prows now adorn museum halls, not as warnings, but as reminders. Their roar has softened into whisper, the whisper of memory, of connection, of the strange peace that follows when enemies finally outlive their reasons to hate. And still, the North remembers. On certain mornings, when the fog rolls in from the sea and the gulls cry over the cliffs of Lindisfarne, it feels as though the centuries collapse. The mist moves the same way it did in 793, curling over the water like a living thing. The sea sighs against the stones, the air tastes of salt and memory, and for a moment you can almost hear it, the faint rhythm of oars cutting water. Not in terror now, but in remembrance, because the same waves that once brought fear now bring reflection. The North Sea, which once divided the world into raiders and victims, now binds their descendants together. The routes that once carried death now carry ferries, cargo ships, and laughter. The waters that once ran red now shimmer with sunlight, indifferent to the past, but never entirely free from it. If you stand on the cliffs of Northumbria or the beaches of Dublin and close your eyes, you might imagine the horizon, as they once saw it, gray, endless, full of possibility. The Vikings were never truly about conquest. They were about discovery, about the ceaseless need to move forward, to see what lies beyond the known. That restless spirit, that yearning for the horizon, still breathes in the veins of the modern world. Every explorer, every sailor, every dreamer who looks to the sea carries a flicker of that same flame. The fog that once concealed longships now conceals memories not of fear, but of transformation. The Vikings did not vanish. They dissolved into the story of humanity, their edges softened by time until they became part of something larger. Beneath the quiet towns and rolling hills, beneath the DNA of nations and the grammar of languages, their presence remains enduring, invisible, indelible. And in the hush of evening, when the wind turns cold and the sea murmurs against the shore, you can still feel them there, not as ghosts, but as echoes. The same wind that once filled their sails still brushes against the stones of Lindisfarne. The same tide that once bore their ships still rises and falls beneath the moon. The North has forgotten nothing. It only whispers now, softly, through the centuries. The legacy of the Vikings lies not in the ruins they left behind, but in the resilience that outlived them. It lies in every word borrowed, every tradition shared, every stubborn heart that endures. History remembers their fury, but it is their endurance that truly survived. And in every northern breeze, if you listen closely, you can still hear it, the distant rhythm of an oar cutting water, steady and patient as time itself, reminding us that the sea never forgets, and neither do we. The fog closes again over Lindisfarne, soft and heavy, as if the sea itself were drawing a curtain across the stage of history. The tide returns, whispering against the stones, washing over what remains, fragments of walls, the faint outlines of the monastery, and the stories that time refuses to forget. It moves with the same rhythm it always has, patient and eternal, erasing the footprints of men but never their echoes. War, like the tide, comes and goes. Empires rise, kingdoms fall, and the world reshapes itself again and again. But the sea remains salt, silence, and memory. The Vikings are gone now, their longships dissolved into legend, their sails folded in the halls of museums. The monks who prayed here, the kings who feared them, the farmers who hid from the raids, all of them have returned to the earth. Only the wind still walks these coasts, and it carries their whispers with it. If you listen closely, it tells the story not of victory, but of endurance. For survival in Dark Age, Britain was never about winning. It was about lasting long enough to see another dawn. The people who lived through those centuries of chaos, the monks, the raiders, the peasants, and the queens, were not heroes in the way legends demand. They were simply human. They endured hunger, fear, loss, and the cold indifference of fate. And in doing so, they built the foundation for everything that came after. The history of that age was written not just in blood, but in resilience and the quiet strength of those who rebuilt what was broken, who buried their dead and went on living. The Viking Age, like the tide, swept across Britain with violence and beauty, leaving behind not destruction, but transformation. The North changed the world not because it conquered it, but because it became part of it. And so, beneath every church and city, beneath every English word and name, the sea still whispers of that time when faith met fire, when chaos became culture, and when survival itself was the greatest triumph. So, if you ever find yourself by the sea on a cold night, and the wind begins to moan through the darkness, don't be afraid. It's probably not ghosts. It's just history breathing in its sleep the breath of all those who lived and died long before you, still mingling with the mist. Close your eyes. Listen to the rhythm of the waves, the slow beat of the tide as it moves in and out like a sleeping giant. The oars grow faint now, their echoes fading into the fog. The North drifts away, returning once more to its endless slumber beneath the gray horizon. And for now, you've survived another night in the Dark Age.